In court, labels travel faster than facts. When my wife called me a useless husband, the room accepted it the way people accept conclusions that sound confident enough to be true. That's how reputations collapse. Not with evidence, but with certainty. What most people don't realize is that silence, when chosen deliberately, can be more dangerous than denial. This isn't a story about winning an argument. It's about what happens when assumptions are allowed to stand long enough to expose themselves. About humiliation mistaken for authority, betrayal framed as concern, and justice arriving only after everyone else has finished talking. One question shifted everything. Not because it was clever, but because it was unavoidable. If you've ever been underestimated, spoken over, or quietly dismissed by someone who assumed you wouldn't notice, this story isn't just familiar. It's instructional, and the moment you understand why silence worked here, you'll never look at restraint the same way again. A useless husband, my wife said in open court. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't sound angry or emotional. It came out flat, measured, like a conclusion she had reached long before this morning. I stayed silent at the respondents' table, hands resting flat against the wood. Still hands don't invite interpretation. That lesson had saved me more than once. The judge didn't respond right away. She looked past my wife and focused on her attorney instead. The pause mattered. In rooms like this, silence isn't absence, it's selection. The accusation wasn't the real humiliation. The real weight sat in the expectation that I would rush to defend myself, that I would fill the space she had carefully left open. That expectation shaped her storytelling, and she trusted it completely. Courtroom 3 felt smaller than it had on paper. Fluorescent lights, worn benches, a clock ticking louder than it should have. I understood then that this wasn't about marriage anymore. It was betrayal framed as concern, control dressed up as justice. I remained quiet, not to endure it, but to let the assumptions settle long enough to reveal themselves. The judge leaned back slightly, fingers resting together, and asked a question that didn't sound confrontational until it landed. "Counselor," she said, "are you certain you understand who your client's husband is and what he actually does?" My wife stiffened beside her attorney. He hesitated just long enough for the room to register it. In that pause, truth began to surface, quietly, without asking permission. 3 weeks earlier, she had filed an emergency petition claiming urgency where none had been demonstrated. Within days, my accounts were frozen, my access restricted, my professional standing placed on hold pending review. On paper, it looked like justice in motion. In practice, it relied entirely on assumptions about competence, awareness, and credibility. Storytelling works best when no one interrupts it too early. The judge didn't accuse, she observed. That distinction mattered. Authority, when it's confident, doesn't rush. It creates space and watches who fills it. I remained silent, not out of fear, but because premature clarity weakens its own impact. Humiliation fades when unsupported, and betrayal struggles to survive prolonged scrutiny. Something subtle had shifted, and the room seemed to sense it before anyone spoke again. When it was finally my turn to speak, I didn't defend myself. I clarified. There's a difference. My work had never been visible in the way people expect competence to look. I don't manage teams or pitch ideas in rooms that applaud. I work in compliance and risk analysis, the kind that happens quietly, long before anything collapses publicly. That distinction had never interested my wife. It mattered now. I explained it without embellishment. My role has always been to notice patterns others overlook, to document inconsistencies without assigning motive, to advise restraint when urgency feels performative. It's not dramatic work. It doesn't reward speed. Truth in this field accumulates. Storytelling, when unsupported by structure, eventually contradicts itself. I had spent decades learning when to speak, and, more importantly, when not to. 8 months earlier, when my mother suffered a stroke, my wife had stepped forward seamlessly. Appointments, accounts, paperwork. She said she'd handle the logistics so I could focus elsewhere. It sounded reasonable. It looked helpful. Power rarely announces itself when it changes hands. It arrives quietly, wrapped in convenience. I didn't question it then. I was still learning what betrayal looks like before it has a name. My mother's death didn't close anything the way people expect endings to work. The services were handled, condolences received, but access remained unchanged. Accounts stayed active. Statements continued to arrive, addressed the same way they always had. Grief creates noise. Systems don't. I noticed the difference before I understood its significance. At first, nothing looked overtly wrong. The amounts were modest, the timing ordinary. What drew my attention was alignment. Transactions clustered around specific dates. Dates that matched my wife's visits to my mother's house. Not medical appointments, not bank meetings, just visits. In my line of work, coincidence earns exactly 1 pass. Repetition doesn't. I didn't confront her. Confrontation introduces variables you can't control. I began reviewing records instead, methodically, without accusation. Truth reveals itself faster when it isn't rushed. What I was seeing didn't feel like theft yet. It felt like structure. And once structure appears, storytelling loses its flexibility. I kept going, knowing that whatever this was, it wouldn't correct itself by being ignored. I returned to my mother's records the way I returned to any system under question, without urgency, without narrative. Bank statements, correspondence, copies filed where she had always kept them. At first, everything looked orderly. Then the sequence began to fray. Statements out of order. Gaps where originals should have been. Small irregularities that only appear when you stop looking for conclusions. That was when I found the power of attorney. It wasn't hidden. It didn't need to be. The language was broad, granting authority without meaningful limitation, signed during a period my mother's doctors described as vulnerable, but not incapacitated. Consent exists on a spectrum. So does responsibility. I noted the date, the scope, the absence of independent counsel, and moved on. I began documenting quietly. Not to accuse, but to preserve coherence. Dates aligned, amounts accumulated, patterns repeated. Truth doesn't announce itself. It stacks. Storytelling, once committed to paper, loses its ability to adapt. I didn't know yet where this would lead, only that clarity was forming. And clarity, once it appears, doesn't recede just because it's inconvenient. My attorney didn't move loudly. She never needed to. Dana requested records through formal channels, verified timelines, and let institutions do what they're designed to do when something doesn't align. No accusations were filed. No urgency was manufactured. Justice, when approached correctly, advances through procedure, not volume. Adult protective services entered the picture without ceremony. Questions were asked. Notes were taken. Banks flagged activity independently, not because I asked them to, but because patterns had crossed thresholds they are trained to recognize. That mattered. Truth carries more weight when it doesn't rely on a single voice to sustain it. At the hearing, Dana presented evidence without framing it as argument. Assumptions were placed beside records and allowed to collapse on their own. The judge didn't interrupt. Authority doesn't need to. Humiliation, once stripped of performance, loses leverage. Betrayal struggles when scrutiny becomes procedural. The room adjusted its posture, and for the first time, my silence no longer looked like absence. The ruling was delivered without emphasis. The emergency petition was denied with prejudice. No revisions. No second attempt. The judge's language was procedural, almost spare, but its effect was final. What had been presented as protection couldn't survive contact with the record. Justice, in this form, didn't need to persuade. It simply concluded. She referred the matter to the district attorney as a matter of course, not punishment. Process, once engaged, moves forward whether anyone is comfortable with it or not. I didn't respond. Vindication rarely arrives with relief. It settles instead, quietly, like alignment returning after prolonged imbalance. Dignity doesn't announce itself when it's restored. As the hearing adjourned, I understood something my wife hadn't anticipated. Silence hadn't delayed the outcome. It had preserved it. Truth, allowed to accumulate without interference, had done its work. What began as humiliation had reversed direction, and the record now reflected that reversal. The case wasn't over, but the narrative no longer belonged to performance. The investigation didn't expand with urgency. It widened. Banks requested additional histories, not weeks but years back. Adult Protective Services conducted separate interviews, careful to avoid conclusions before comparison. Each system moved independently, which was the point. Truth gains authority when it doesn't depend on coordination. At home, the effects were less orderly. Our children were pulled into competing explanations, each framed as concern. I didn't correct them. Correction feels like pressure. I told them to be accurate instead, to answer what was asked, to avoid speculation, to let their own observations stand. Dignity survives best when it isn't coached. Subpoenas followed quietly, records aligned, discrepancies didn't argue, they accumulated. Storytelling fractured as timelines were placed side by side. Betrayal resists many things, but it struggles against synchronized documentation. I stayed consistent. Consistency is a form of restraint, and restraint, applied long enough, becomes momentum. The case didn't resolve in a single motion. It narrowed. Evidence was compared, then compared again. Subpoenas closed remaining gaps. Eventually, the structure held without assistance. An indictment followed, not dramatic, just precise. The plea came later. A felony, probation, restitution, and permanent restrictions on fiduciary authority. Justice arrived without spectacle, the way it usually does when systems finish their work. I watched the outcome from a distance. Vindication doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like quiet confirmation. The terms mattered less than the record itself. Truth doesn't seek punishment. It seeks coherence. What had been taken was ordered returned. What had been misrepresented was corrected. Dignity, once displaced, settled back where it belonged. Life adjusted slowly afterward. My employer reinstated me under oversight. The children found their own understanding in time, without being pushed. Silence had been mistaken for weakness, but it had been vigilance all along. Redemption didn't come from speaking louder. It came from letting the record remain intact long enough to be believed. What this story shows isn't that silence always wins. It shows that silence only works when it's intentional, when it's supported by facts, consistency, and the patience to let systems reveal what people try to hide. Truth doesn't need urgency. It needs time. And justice doesn't arrive when emotions peak. It arrives when records align. So ask yourself, where in your life have you been reacting too quickly? Where have you been trying to prove something instead of documenting it? What would happen if, just once, you let clarity build instead of forcing resolution? Dignity isn't reclaimed by noise. It's reclaimed by coherence. And vindication rarely looks the way we imagine it will. If this story made you rethink how you handle conflict, power, or being underestimated, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment and share what stood out. And if you want to keep learning how quiet decisions, long timelines, and deliberate restraint can change outcomes, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There's more ahead, and it's worth paying attention.